Well, it's really hard to discuss about my research and to gather all the information and all together in this half an hour. So a few years ago, like 2012, I was accepted to do my PhD in London. And I chose to do something around intimate violence between husbands and wives in Palestine. And when I went there, it was kind of for me a way of escaping the situation here and try to choose a very easy subject to study, not talking about politics where I grew up. I will tell you more about it later on. So there, I start working on this topic, but then I found it's not my interest. And then I started to follow the news a lot when I was in London. And I start to try to understand the situation here in Palestine from different perspectives. So I'm gonna tell you a little bit how I grew up as a Palestinian. I grew up in a very politicized environment. I was born to a refugee family from Jaffa. I experienced the first intifada in my childhood, in which we faced the Israeli military forces in our streets, school, and even homes. So like most Palestinians, I was constantly aware of the politics and the conflict with the Israeli occupation with all this context. When I decided to do my PhD, as I said, I chose the easy way to escape this complex situation. I chose to study the intimate partner violence. I arrived to UK with this idea. I tried to avoid all the experiences we lived in Palestine. But after long discussion around my topic with my supervisors, following the news in Palestine, I lost interest in my initial research. I became more attached to the political situation, which was at the time connected to prisoners, and found my passion to understand the experience of imprisonment, especially for women. As a Palestinian, I grew up hearing praise for freedom fighters and being told their heroic stories. There were few women who would hear about, such as Dalal Mughrabi, Layla Khalid, though we used to see their pictures in the street and feel appreciation for them. It was rare to read anything about women in prison or in military groups. They were just numbers. We didn't know who they were, their stories, or why they were arrested, and this is still the case. My interest in this research began when I learned about prisoners, struggles, and resistance inside prison. I had heard about women in prison, but had never had a conversation with any of them before this research. I wondered who these women were and why they were imprisoned. So I started my fieldwork by following the hunger strike of Hana Shalabi in 2012. Shalabi was demanding release and calling attention to the injustice of administrative detention. She was later exiled to Gaza. I followed the coverage of her strike in the media and on Facebook groups to understand what people were thinking about her and her actions, and how, as a woman, her experience was different from that of men. So I began to attend the support tent for all Palestinian prisoners in my hometown of Nablus in order to meet former prisoners and chat with them about their experience. So I was struck by their strength and political commitment, as well as how they talked about their experiences inside prison. So I found myself asking, why we never heard about these women's story? They were just shadows without names to those of us on the outside. My surprise grew when I found out that many of the women I had worked with before beginning the research to organize social activities for women or any social activities were themselves former prisoners. Yet they had never shared this with me or with anyone who worked with them. They just mentioned they were imprisoned in Israel without giving details about their own stories or experiences. So this made me question why they didn't talk about their experience. Why did they ignore or deny it? Maybe the silence around women prisoners was due to the male-dominant culture that praised men as heroic for filling their roles of protecting their land and people. But which positions women are as perpetual victim in need of protection and unable to defend themselves. Though we never heard much about Palestinian women in prison. We did hear a lot about Jamila Bouhaired, an Algerian nationalist who opposed French colonial rule and who was imprisoned and tortured. Bouhaired was the ideal for a lot of the women I interviewed, with many of them describing how her experience encouraged them to join military groups defending their country. In reality, Palestinian women have always played major roles in the resistance movements, but this involvement was in the shadow. During the second Intifada, I began to hear more about women who became freedom fighters or were imprisoned by Israel. Maybe media had developed in Palestine, and we started to get more TV channels after the establishment of the Palestinian Authority. Previously, our channels were limited and most of them were under the supervision of the Israeli Authority. Now, news about women fighters and their participation in politics and resistance become more accessible. I had an idealized image of those women in Israeli prisons experiencing the same torture and injustice that Bouhaired had. I perceived them as living a continuous resistance, confronting Israeli soldiers at all times. I constantly wondered what they were doing in prison, how they spent their time, and how they managed to challenge traditional Palestinian culture to join military groups in the first place. Growing up in the same patriarchal gender setting arrangement, I had been exposed to what the community think of these women and the shock with which they perceive them. So I realized that not all women activists experience the community appreciation. Rather, they are met with concerns about their honor and suspicion that they may have been subject to sexual abuse. There is a stigma attached to women who were in prison, that they are sexually impure and have lost their femininity. In undertaking this research, I wanted to learn about the women's actual stories and to hear directly from them about their personal experience, feelings, and thoughts. So I started my fieldwork in London, reading the 2 volumes, Diary of Aisha Ode, 2005-2013, one of the first Palestinian to write about her experience in Israeli detention. She was imprisoned for 10 years and then released in a prisoner exchange in 1979. She was exiled outside of Palestine for another 15 years, returning to live there after the establishment of the Palestinian Authority in 1995. In her diary, she reflects on the contributions of women to the resistance movement, and also focuses on the obstacles that women face participating in military groups and during arrest and imprisonment. Reading Gaude's autobiography gave me an orientation from which to plan my interviews and while questioning what to ask. On the other hand, her experience also gave me the impression that all Palestinian women who were in prison faced the same condition and had the similar backgrounds in terms of their membership in political movements or participation in militant action. When I started my fieldwork, I found that women have different stories and experiences. They negotiate their own space and draw their boundaries in different ways. Furthermore, their involvement in resistance movement varies. Strikingly, I have interviewed women who were imprisoned in different periods, from the early 70s through the present. Mindful of the importance of acknowledging the plurality of women's lived experience in my work, I have paid close attention to the social, political, and geographical backgrounds of the participant, whether they are married, divorced, or single, if they have children, their economical situation, and whether they come from a city or refugee camp or village can significantly shape women's experience in politics and military action. Attending to such issue helps to eliminate the differences among my participants, as well as among Palestinian women resisting the occupation more generally. It also helps draw out connections between women's social, economic, and religious background and the way in which they negotiate and reconcile different spaces, including that of prison. Women who participated in the research were from the West Bank, as you know, as noted. Uh, as Palestinian researchers living in the West Bank, it is impossible to access the Gaza Strip because of the restrictions the Israeli occupation imposed on our mobility between the two areas. Through this research, I start to imagine, and from the narratives and the experiences I heard, I start to imagine what is prison. So I'm gonna take you with me to this journey, learning about prison from some participant testimonies or memories. So Ahlam, who served 5 years of a life sentence, started our conversation by describing prison. She used powerfully evocative metaphors to illustrate the experience of isolation, restriction, and control. She said, prison is doors and keys like a big box with 4 doors with another box inside and another box. This is prison. She said, I left prison with breathing problems because everywhere is closed. This statement is a reflection on how closed and isolated space inside prison is. To live in a box is to be disconnected from the outside world, with innumerable boundaries imposed upon a person's thinking, behaviors, mobility, and action. In response, the inmates start to create a world of her own inside these boxes, solitary and disconnected from the things going on outside the box. Incarceration begins with the disengagement with the outside world. Incarceration initiates the inmate's social death in the outside world. It is simultaneously produce the possibility for both a lack of a sense of personal autonomy and for selfhood to raise through resistance. Indeed, Ahlam experienced a form of social death. Cut off from her interaction with her family and community, she was left alone. Ahlam describes how these connections of boxes that constructs prison create multiple layers of isolation for the prisoners, namely their isolation from the outside world, and especially from her own family and community. In her account, women are thus served from their most critical ties of social belonging through the organization of space. In this regime of isolation, women lose their own space, privacy, and autonomy. We learn from Ahlam how people become something other than autonomous in such conditions. It is in prison that some women start to think about who they are and also seek to represent themselves as political subjects, having not understood themselves in this way prior to imprisonment. Relatedly, though the women are bounded by the Israeli prison authority control over them, and also the surveillance outside women nevertheless attempt to resist and become more autonomous, though severely isolated. The imprisoned women are always aware of being watched, of being under the constant surveillance of the prison guards. Ahlam imagines the guard as dogs. The guards are like dogs, she said, with keychains around their neck. Each guard with the same thing, a lot of keys. You enter from one door to another door to another door till you reach your room. The doors are really thick and closed all the time. They were only allowed to be open at specific time, and you would have some times for relief. Ahlam's description of prison guards as dogs reflects her sense of fear and mistrust in their presence. As noted, in Palestinian and other Arab culture, dogs are not well thought of animals, rather than being associated with friendlessness and loyalty. As in many Western culture, it is the opposite. For Palestinian, dogs evoke violence and aggression. Ahlam perceived the guard's role to make sure that she is behaving well, and if she is not, to attack her. These ominous guards also wear keys, reminding the prisoners of the space and momentary freedoms over which they control all access. If these guards are satisfied with prisoners' attitudes, then they can decide to open doors, thus controlling the prisoners through rewards as well as surveillance and violence. The guards and the prison administration have control over prisoners' daily life and also set the rules of prisoners. The keys they wear are physically the only means through which women can go through the different doors of the prison and thus access such necessities of family visits, medication, reading material, and open space. But as these keys are worn around their necks, the guards are the ones who have the power and wild control over this space. The authority are an ever presented feature of the women's lives in prison. As one of the women said, the administration is watching us all the time. If it is not the officer, then it is the guard. The social life and relationship between Palestinian women political prisoners act as a form of disciplinary power. The women's constant awareness of being watched shapes their action, both physically and psychologically. Bearing the surveillance becomes part of their daily lives in prison, become natural. Women in prison live in suffocatingly limited space, a series of boxes as Ahlam vividly described. Reducing the space allocated to the body under surveillance, but this space is interacting directly with the subject's agency of resistance. Severed socially and physically from the outside world, women have very limited method to learn about what is happening outside. Family visits are heavily restricted with the reading material they can get through the Red Cross or other charitable donation. The radio program and TV, again restricted. Letters and lawyers' visits, family visits are only allowed every 3 to 4 weeks, even if the person is lucky and not facing any punishment. These visits typically last for maximum of half an hour and take place through thick glasses dividers, preventing any physical interaction. These visits furthermore take places under surveillance. The restrictions governing their interaction with family increase the prison's sense of isolation and living. As Ahlam explained, the experience is dehumanizing. Prison is a zoo, she said. They put you in a cage and start looking at you. It's hard and humiliating. Being locked up, even during visits, which continual restrictions and surveillance, made Ahlam feel she was being managed as if she were a dangerous animal that needed to be caged and under constant surveillance. There is an important transition for women prisoners from the interrogation period during which they were in isolation cells to the prison cells that they share with other women. Etaf reflect upon these relations. Prison is a cemetery of living people, the experience of friendship and the gloating of enemy. This statement reflects the death of outside world for the inmates and the ways in which their lives become structured through incarceration and relations with others inside this symmetry. To live in asymmetry means the death of their dreams and future. But for most of the women I interviewed, building relations inside helped them to survive their isolation from the outside world and also to normalize the space of prison. These relations are forged in socio-political hierarchy that is based on solidarity, similarity, and unity. Women in prison are in a constant confrontation with the Israeli occupation. Most women in prison believe in the injustice of their imprisonment and the Israeli control over the Palestinian prisoners. In their perception, the Israeli authority enjoy this control as a form of revenge, a notion reflected in a tough description of the gloating of enemy. This sense of the Israeli pleasure in their incarceration encouraged women to resist and hold steadfast in their imprisonment by acting strong and creating their own lives inside prison. Mariam was in prison in the late 60s. Mariam recalled when the Israeli prison staff were celebrating Israel Independence Day, which in the same day on which Al-Nakba is memorialized. The prison staff had put the Israeli flags up around all the prison, which made Palestinian women angry. They felt that this was a provocation directed at them and decided to challenge it. They arranged to take down all the Israeli flags when they were in timeout. They succeeded in doing so and were happy about their achievement. For them, taking down the flags was a means of showing their sumud inside prison. The women were put in isolation for punishment and then moved to another prison in harsher condition. However, as Mariam said, we never cared about their punishment. So this is like the way that I've tried to take you in this journey to imagine how life in prison looks like and how these women experience prison. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Sama. That is such a rich set of narratives and also so many instances of resistance, taking down the Israeli flags, but even calling the guards dogs, which is perhaps another way of resisting them. I wanted to ask you a bit about, could you say a bit more about the kinds of relationships, the importance of the relationships between women in prison, and maybe how leaving prison affected those relationships and those connections?
So I just want to, I'm not sure if I'm taking a longer time, but
no, you're fine. You're fine.
So I just want to say a little bit about this social circle among women in prison. So in prison, the environment is built upon the diminishing of agency and individualism. Women are generalized into political subjects, political prisoners, political movement activists, freedom fighters, resistors, and so on. There are, however, moments in which they cannot only express their individualism, but also exist as individuals. During the day, prisoners are granted a short time of release for 45 minutes from their cell. They spend the time outside of their rooms in a small communal hall, usually an open space. Prisoners have the opportunity to meet with the women from different cells. They gather to chat, eat, and drink coffee together and to exchange books and ideas. Sabrine felt that this was her time to build relationships and meet with her close friends. She said, I used to have strong relationships with all women. We used to have a nice gathering, inviting each other for lunch and release time or having coffee. So for her, she started to build these connections and start to be close to women in prison, she started to build her social circle. In this circle of friends, women create a space of liberation in which they can talk about their experiences, of course, because they have all the time to show and perform as political subject. But now in this circle, they can talk about their emotions, secret, without surveillance or expectation, because they are suing some national themes and doing something national themes, but in under this cover, they are talking about themselves. Khawla shared her romance with the group leader of her political organization, who was also imprisoned during same period with her cellmate. He used to send her love letters. So she said, "We loved each other before prison. He used to write me letters. He was a poet, and he used to write nice words for me. All our wing used to read them. I wasn't shy at all. These letters used to change the prison environment." For Khawla, sharing her private letters with her close friends was a way of strengthening solidarity with them, sharing her dreams, a word of the love and emotion they were deprived of inside prison, made women feel happy and created something new to talk about. This is something they used to do because, like, women in prison, they are under kind of double surveillance. The community outside prison, the guards, they have all the time to perform politically, which is really tough. So they start to find this space of liberation. So then, moving from a closed prison to an open air prison, as they mentioned, this initial release for imprisonment is full of joy as women experience relative freedom after the isolation, restrictions, control, and surveillance of the Israeli prison. The conditions of women's release vary. Some of the women I interviewed were released after finishing their sentence, others were released through prisoners' exchange agreements. Most of women have similar feelings about being released to a new world. They don't know if they have changed or if it is the world outside that has changed. Rania, for example, was released in a prisoner exchange after spending 10 years inside. She said, it is really tough. It is a new space. You need to learn about it, to build up relations with people again. But the problem is you have a lot of contradictions. You have a lot of memories, but your perspectives, beliefs, and feelings have changed. But they are the same people. The contradiction is the people are the same. So how can I change my feelings? How can I adapt my mood among all of these contradictions? It was really hard to integrate. Former prisoners feel a gap between themselves and the world they left. Women start to realize how prison has changed them and feel distance from those close to them. From her statement, we can see the contradictory feelings about the space and people around her. The experience of release is a search for a link between two worlds. Within the confinement of prison, the women create their own world. They build strong relations with the women who shared the same room, food, and experiences. Sometimes they felt close to each other inside this space in the outside world where they had memories and experiences before imprisonment. After release, they began to feel like strangers. They often still feel imprisoned as they try to adapt to the space and find that even with their close family, they feel strangers. Many of the participants in this research stated that they felt they had left a small prison to live in a larger open air prison. One of them said, "You discover that you cannot get prison out of you. You carry it inside you. It confronts you with every details. Your life in prison dictates to you your behavior on the outside world. In other words, You did not leave prison. You actually carried prison with you. The manner in which prison can become internalized in former inmates, which Aisha Ode describes here, illustrated how the prison experience influence women and affect their lives' relation with their surrounding. They built their own world and routine inside prison for a period in which they were incarcerated. And so when they leave prison, they leave it with contradictory emotions. After spending times with their friends inside, whom they built trust and understanding to become like family upon release, they feel strange, and this can cause feeling of isolation. I'm gonna talk about some little example. One of them, it's around a mother who left her.
Probably just a minute or two, if that's okay, Summer.
Okay, this is the last thing I will finish.
Thank you.
So like the attempt to reunify with children after release can create another form of pressure for women trying to reintegrate into their former lives. When returning to the life from which they have been absent, some women immediately recognize the change that they have occurred while they were inside, while others try to ignore them and get back to their lives as if their imprisonment never happened. Brenda, for example, was released after 4 years of incarceration. She went back to her home and tried to ignore the fact she had been in prison. She behaved as tough, nothing had changed. She recalled, I used to treat them like children, her children, young children, the same age that I left them. Once I was trying to help my son to put on his socks. He was 13 or more. His sister looked at me and said, Mom, he's old, not a child. Why are you doing this? When her daughter said this to her, she realized that her children had grown and become independent. They didn't need her help. She also realized that she had missed some of their growing up. Randa tried to compensate them for her 4 years absence, not acknowledging that her children had changed and that they felt strange about the way she was treating them during her absence. Their need changed, of course. So I'll stop here. Maybe in the question we can talk more about it.
I think there'll be a lot more to talk about in the questions, and thank you so much. And that last example was so poignant that I think everybody could identify with that experience. But you've shared so much with us, and I think what you've done is really help combine the richness and the multiplicity of women's experience in prison. So thank you so much, and we'll come back to a discussion after Victoria's presentation. So it's a great pleasure now to introduce Victoria Britton, who has been a journalist and a writer, and Victoria has written widely on human rights issues, both in the Middle East, but also beyond in Africa. And she's written a great deal on apartheid, South Africa, and the anti-apartheid struggle. And I think she's particularly been committed to amplifying the voices of women and children in human rights contexts of human rights abuses. Victoria has been very closely connected to Palestine for many, many years. She said 30, but I suspect it may be slightly more. And she has, as well as writing, she was a co-founder of the Palestine Literary Festival and also the Palestine Book Awards. And she has also been a great friend of the UK-Palestine Mental Health Network and Café Palestine. So welcome to you, Victoria. And maybe just to start by asking you about your connection with the topic that we are discussing, and particularly through the films of my mastery. You need to unmute, Victoria.
Okay, sorry about that. Well, I started by saying thank you very much for your very generous introduction. How can I say? I mean, my first experiences really in Palestine was being invited by Dr. Ayad Sarraj to Gaza, and he had the idea that I could write something about the Gaza Community Mental Health Program, which he would use for fundraising in the Gulf. Well, of course, it didn't happen. I mean, I wrote the thing, but either it didn't appeal in the Gulf or the money wasn't coming or it was coming differently. But anyway, I became very attached to Ayad, and I learned so much from him and from his team, who would take me around from family to family that they were working with. And well, it's not the time to talk about that, but it was an amazing introduction to something I knew nothing about. I've been living in Africa for, I don't know, 12 years or something, 10 years, and I knew very little. So Ayad was my mentor in listening. And in the course of that time, I saw the first of May's BBC films, the first one of the trilogy about children, and I met her. And over the years, I watched her films, and I saw her when I was in Lebanon, and I realized that she was doing something that I thought was unique, and it completely chimed with what I tried to do as a war correspondent. I was often teased by the other correspondents. Oh, are you writing about orphans again? Or, oh, are you writing about women again? Whereas they preferred to write about war in the context of men's wars. And I felt that you only really get the texture of wars from women. So I was very, very attracted to May's work. So when I was asked to write a book about her, I felt it was like an amazing gift. So I want to get on to today's topic by saying, I think Gwen's idea of linking May's films to Samar's presentation was a really wonderful concept. And I was touched by the idea that you have these two Palestinian women of different generations, different backgrounds, and one is an academic and the other is an artist. And for both of them, their work is rooted in the experience of women's incarceration by Israel. And both of them have seized on the strength and creativity of the women that they've met in the course of their work. And also, particularly in May's work, what comes out is the political importance of these women within the Palestinian resistance. And another thing that is clearly the parallel between the two is the way that the women are telling their own stories. And in the case of May's films, these stories are often built on decades of shared experiences and these long, long relationships. So what May has given us is 4 short segments from her feature film 3000 Nights, which is set in the early 1980s in an Israeli jail. And we're going to play them. I'll just give you a sentence between each one. And the first one is the trailer of the film. And in it, we see Leal, the central character, who is a young Palestinian teacher, not linked to resistance politics at all, but whose life is upended and she's into prison because she stopped her car in a rainstorm to give a young man a lift against the rain. So Graham, can we have the first one, please? So the second shows the routine brutality and repression within the prison. And it underlines the injustice of the military court system, which you saw a little bit of there in the trailer. And that's what landed her here. And the third one is a very tender portrait of motherly love as Leal plays with her baby son, Noor, who was born in prison, as you saw earlier. And you watch her nurture his imagination and feed her own with a little wooden bird. It transforms into a real bird. And day after day, she watches birds outside the cell bars, signifying the freedom she'll have again one day. And the last one is a scene of the women in their cell preparing for a prison strike in the context of the 1982 massacres in Sabra and Shatila camps in Beirut by right-wing Lebanese militia allied to the Israeli forces, which invaded, bombed, and besieged Beirut. I expect you notice the use of music in all those clips, which so intensifies the atmosphere of each different element of the film. And I'm sure you also probably noticed when they were in the cell, each time they were in the cell, the differentiation of all the characters, which echoes a bit something that Samar said about how each one's experience and history is different. And Leal is the most different because she's in no way involved previously in the resistance. And this was May's first feature film. And as you saw in the trailer, it won very many awards. And it's still very much a staple of film festivals in many countries. You can watch it at home on Vimeo and on Amazon Prime, I'm very happy to say. And one thing I want to stress is that all the female actors are Palestinians, playing both prisoners and Israeli guards. And most of them had deep personal and family experiences of these very scenes of being political prisoners from within their families. And I think that the capacity to show the level of emotion that this film shows comes from that very personal space that everybody was in. And I want to very briefly put this film and these scenes into the context of May's documentaries, which actually span 40 years of the linked history of Palestine and Lebanon and Israel, namely Israeli bombing and invasions and a 22-year Israeli occupation of Lebanon, and the two intifadas, the uprising of Palestinian children and youth. And throughout all these years, the normalization of these occupations and incarcerations and tortures and exiles and disappearances and assassinations, that is the inescapable texture woven into Palestinian life. And women are key to it. And what's exceptional about these films, aside from their consistency, is that this overwhelming violence is shown mainly through the eyes of children and the lives of children, and through the iconic women who often appear in more than one film. And for all of them, their prison experience is central. And I want to highlight the notorious secretive Khiam prison in occupied South Lebanon, where 3 of May's film's central women were among those Palestinian and Lebanese political prisoners held. Now, Khiam was liberated by the local people on May the 26th, 2000, the day after the Israeli army retreated over the border from their 22-year occupation, in extraordinary scenes of Palestinian joy on both sides of the border. Now, 3 of these iconic women, Kifar, Khadija, Sohar, and their Khiam prison experience still has tremendous resonance today in Lebanon. And at the opening of 3000 Nights in Shatila camp, Kifar was the person who made the opening remarks, and the amazing contrast between the woman who's you will have seen in previous films as a prisoner or revisiting her own cell, and this completely composed, shining figure in Shatila on that night of such joy of the film. And similarly at the Ramallah opening in the West Bank, the audience was filled with former prisoners, not only women prisoners, but also men prisoners. And they almost sort of took over the whole occasion because they were so absolutely overcome with seeing their experience so truthfully presented. And many of the people there were actually the people whose stories had been part of the film's origins, some of them 20 or 30 years before. And I think we have to see May's work as an illumination of this whole history. And with the history, an illumination of Palestinian identity. And at this particular time, I think it's crucially important that these films should be seen and appreciated, because we're in a period where the powers that be want this history forgotten. They don't want it to be part of the present day, but it is, and May's films express that. So thank you again, May, for spending all this time with me over these years to write this book. Anyway, I hope you you enjoyed it, or yes, it is the right word, because it's exhilarating. The films are exhilarating. So shall I stop there?
Well, we'll probably want to move on to some discussion, which I hope you will definitely be part of. But thank you so much, Victoria. And it's such a privilege also to have May with us as well, in an observing capacity. And so we're doubly blessed. But I think for me, that combination of the representations through film and then the very detailed oral testimonies that you brought out in your research, Summer, gives such a wonderful, multifaceted view on all those complex dilemmas for women prisoners. And I guess I wonder whether it would be possible perhaps to ask each of you something a bit more about, because May's film, I think, was made in 2015 about prisoners in 2000 and 2002. Sorry, 1982. And so we have such a sense of history, and I wonder if it would be possible to say a little bit more about what you think the changes are for women, for women's politicization, for women as political prisoner. It comes out a lot in the film, I think, but I'd like perhaps to ask both of you what you think the different issues have been for women over these last 3 decades. Would you like to start, Summer? Yeah.
Okay, so for me, whenever I watched the movie first time, I was doing my fieldwork. So it was kind of, I was trying to guess who was this woman and try to find out. And I found that there are lots of commonality among the experiences women had while I was listening to their narratives and experiences and watching the movie. The thing is that, as I said before, there were, I don't know if I said, but there were more than 17,000 women experienced Israeli prison since the late 60s till prison. Until now, there are 37 women still imprisoned. And the situation of prisons changed. So I wasn't aiming to look into the historical development of prison, but of course, while listening to the different narratives from the different generation brought this up. So the thing is that when we look into the women in the late in the early 70s till 80s, the structure of prison was different. After the second intifada, things changed, and in the second intifada, things changed completely. The way women were allocated, the way that, for example, in the 80s and late 70s, women were forced to work in prison, and they used to eat together with the Israeli civil criminals, so they were allocated in the same prisons. So there were lots of issues and lots of problems with women in there. In the second intifada, or after the 78, let's say, things changed. So they start in the second intifada to put women, allocate them alone in individual prisons. So this is one perspective. For women, they, like, I think we can compare it to the recent ones, the 37, the women, they go to prison now. I have to say, if we look into those women who go to prison at the moment, most of them, they are student activists. They don't have anything to do with kind of military action or fights. They just have this awareness. They are from universities, most of them, lots of them. They have this strong kind of beliefs, and they are aware about the situation. If we look into women who were in prison and second intifada, mostly they were part of any military action, or they are part of the resistance movements somehow. In the 80s, women who were participating in demonstration or trying to hide fighters or help fighters, they were in prisons, and the same as for 70s. So it's kind of the way that women go in prison is kind of same things. But when we look into the prison allocation, for example, women are allocated now according to their political affiliation. So when any woman is in prison, they will ask her, which political movement do you belong to? Of course, this is part of the resistance. They cannot say which politic. They cannot collaborate with the prison guards, because it's kind of it's not. This is a way of the resistance for them. So they usually don't say, but of course the prison administration, they have their history and they know everything about them, as they claim. So they will allocate each woman according to her political affiliation, or if she's close to any of the political movements within prison. So each wing has different, like Fatah, Hamas, the left wings. And then sometimes they try to punish women, especially who were imprisoned for, like, and they were clear about their political affiliation. For example, if someone from the PLFP, they will try to punish her by putting her with a religious group, for example, or someone from Fatah, to create this tension among prisoners and to create this kind of conflict among prisoners. At the same time, it was kind of, for women in the 80s, they always say that we always have these political affiliations, but it's not like in the second intifada way of allocating women according to their political affiliation and all this kind of things. So I think it depends, as I understood from all this kind of women I interviewed, and I'm still working on it with some. I think it depends on the number of women in prison. They decide how to allocate them, and they decide how to structure the prison inside. Now they put all women together because it's just a few number for them, 37, and there are some minor women in prison as well.
I just wonder whether you could say how many women are in administrative detention in prison rather than on sentences.
The total number is 37. I'm not sure, to be honest, but I will check in a second the exact number of the administrative detainees, women. I missed it.
Well, it's
Sorry.
okay. We can put it in the chat. And I just wondered if you'd like to add anything to that, Victoria.
Yeah, I'd like to make a couple of points. One is I'd like to mention a book that people, and I'll put this in the chat in a minute, a book written by a number of Palestinian political prisoners now released, which was put together by the Iraqi writer Haifa Zangana. And she spent many months in workshops getting these women who were, again, as Samar said, very, very differentiated. Everyone is very, very different. But it's a completely lovely book. And in terms of showing how it feels to have been a Palestinian political prisoner, I think you'll love it. And I'll put it in the chat in a second. The second point I wanted to make was that there was an event in December called Palestine Writes, which was an online thing which went on for about 3 days. It was all about writers. And one of the kind of highlights of it at the very end was the appearance of the two daughters of Khalida Jara, who read a very long letter from their mother about prison conditions. And you can find that on the Palestine Rights website. And I think it gives an incredibly good idea of what it is to be a prominent political prisoner, woman political prisoner today. It's a wonderful testimony. And the third thing I wanted to say was that before I worked on all of this, I used to live in Algiers. And one of my overwhelmingly kind of eye-opening moments was when I met some of the former women guerrilla fighters who had played such a heroic role in the war. And most of them, I would say, not all, but most of them, the one thing they wanted to say was that what happens to women after being prominent and imprisoned and tortured and all of that, and heroines during a particular period, that when the period politically changes, it's a case of back to the kitchen, girls. And I can't tell you how many people and how surprised I was to hear this from women of such very high political, heroic pasts. Anyway, I'll stop there and put those things in the chat as I said I would.
That's very interesting. And just maybe before we go to questions, we've got quite a few questions. I just wanted to connect that last comment by Victoria to your work with, you run a group, I think, don't you, Samak, for ex-women who have been political prisoners. And I wondered whether maintaining some of that sense of identity and the struggle and women's struggle, does that, as a kind of counterpose to back to the kitchen, does that come up in the group as an issue of maintaining a certain kind of identity?
I had this conversation with some of them who are really activists in the Money Women organization, and I asked them if, like, it's like two parts, let's say like this. The first one was like if they consider them as, like, when they were participating on any action or they are taking role as kind of feminists, trying to show their strength and all this kind of thing, women roles. And one of them said, or many of them said to me, they said, we didn't think about ourselves as women or anything. It's just something like we start to do after prison, but before it was our role and our passion to do something for Palestine. We never thought about ourselves as women. We want to participate. It's not something we plan to do. So this is a part of it. And then if we look into the women movement here in Palestine, like they say, liberating the land, then will bring the women to liberation, take all their rights. So this is kind of what is happening in many Arab contexts, that is kind of connecting liberating women or giving women rights to liberating the land. but at the same time, it's kind of long struggle. It's like more than 70 years now, and still doing or thinking about things. However, the women movement in Palestine, they are trying to do things, but it is kind of hesitating when the political situation is bad, because the priority is to think about Palestine, is not to think about women. So it's kind of the situation play a great role with the women movement here in Palestine.
Thank you. We have quite a few questions. There's somebody called Isa who had, I think, put her hand up, but there isn't a question in the chat. But I just wondered, are you still here, Isa? And if you've got a question, would you like to ask it? I don't know whether Isa is still with us, but I wanted to invite her to ask a question if she had one. Okay, well, maybe she will join us later. So the next question I have is from David Harold. Maybe you would just like to ask your question, David. It's a question about Israeli prison guards, I think.
And it was prompted by watching the film extracts, really. What does interaction with female Israeli guards do for Palestinian women prisoners? I mean, these Israeli female guards present a very different picture of being women.
Would you like to, which of you would like to go for that? Would you like to have a go at that one first?
I'll just let me make one comment about that, which is that in the making of the film, the Palestinian women who played the Israeli guards, as May explained to me, they did it with such gusto and such knowledge, such deep knowledge. They actually enjoyed building up the characters of the Israeli guards. So my interpretation of that was that that on the whole, the prisoners felt themselves extremely much in control of the people who thought they were controlling them. And in the memoirs of Soha Bashara, for instance, who's written a lot about her time in Kiyan, that is a very strong thing that comes out.
Thank you, Sama.
Yeah, I mean, there were lots of this kind of, even, for example, many of the women, they used to say, you know, women guards are worse than men because they are how they expose women and how they try. But they said that, of course, we have our way to resist them and to show them that they are nothing, because for us, they are really nothing. This is how they used to explain this kind of relationship with those women as guards. And there were lots of kind of conflict all the time with the prison administration and the guards around them, and how they used to maneuver or find ways around those guards, and how they used to arrange their life, kind of ignoring them somehow. At the same time, prison guards, they need to show their power, and they need to show their control over those women with many tactics they use and the threat they use with these women.
Thank you. And the next question is from Aisha. Quite a short question. Is there any mental health support available for women once they are released?
So can I say something about this?
Yes, please.
Unfortunately, we don't have because I have this forum, that I still have this kind of forum with women who were in prison. So we meet once in 2 weeks or 3 weeks, and they like to talk, and sometimes they bring new people. So our forum starts with like 5 people, and now it's maybe 15 or 20 sometimes. And most of them, they try to invite other women to talk and to just share their experiences. And the thing they keep saying, that they feel that they didn't have the services, and they didn't have, I mean, there is lots of mental health network in Palestine, but I think they need to arrange a special program targeting those women who were in prison, because each one of them have different experiences, and they are not really aware about these services in Palestine. So there is no special program targeting those women.
Thank you. And there are two questions from Nadra, so I'm going to ask Nadra to ask those. But just before, there was one about children being born in prison, as of course we saw in the film. Are they allowed to go to relatives, or do they remain with the mother? And what effect does this have on the child in the future?
I can only tell you that they can only stay with the mother. You saw that scene when they can only stay until they're 4, and you saw her come and take the child from Leal.
And I thought it's 2 years. They can stay with their mother inside
2 years.
Prison for 2 years. And it is the experience of leaving prison is the hard one for them. Like one of my participants, she gave birth in prison. And when her son was 2, it was hard for him. Of course, they bring joy to prison. So all women start to play the role of mothers for this child. But when they are released, these children, they are sent to their family, they start to find the shock of living outside the prison. For example, this woman said to me that her son was surprised how tomato grow, like on a plant, the plant of tomato or the mint. And then he was kind of afraid to walk on the street pavement, because he didn't know what was this, what it was strange for him to walk on the street. So I think it's like a child grow in a locked place. They don't know what's going outside the world. And then the thing is, when they are released and they have to learn how to live with other people, which become kind of stranger for them to learn about these people around them, their fathers, sisters, or aunties or grandmothers. It's kind of a new word for them. It's a new shock for them. And then when the mother was released, it's a new experience 3 years after his release, is to learn about her child, and her child to remember who was this woman. So it's kind of complex, I think, feeling for these children.
Thank you, Summer. I'm going to invite Nadra to ask her 2 questions.
Yeah.
Are you with us somewhere
Yes.
now, Nadra?
Yes.
Great. Thanks.
Thank you for amazing insights and important insights. I was wondering whether you can share with us the uniqueness or the characteristics of having a girl child as a political prisoner. You know, I'm just reflecting on the case of Fatima Hijazi, who ended up being killed on Damascus Gate in Jerusalem, and her own frustration being imprisoned for a short period of time, and what happened inside the prison. It was extremely important to her, and then her extrajudicial killing here in Jerusalem on May the 7th, 2018. And the second question is whether you're aware of the writing of Israeli scholars such as Anat Barko and Edna Erez that are their writing is extremely upsetting to me, disturbing to me, when they're saying that they're calling acts of women's acts of resisting occupation oppression as terrorism, as self-help. And so I was wondering whether you can juxtapose their findings that are disturbing again to me with your findings, Samah.
Okay, thank you. For girl children, it is kind of a kind of totally different experience than the adult ones, because they have to become adult for a sudden. Like they were arrested. I mean, I didn't study women like children, prisoners, but one of my students is doing her research around this. So we found out that those women, those girls, let's say, when they are arrested, they learn how to act as adults. So they start to do whatever adults are doing, try to resist, try to keep their sumud, try to not to collaborate with the interrogator, try to not to collaborate with the prison guards, and etc. Of course, these girls are under supervision from the adult women inside prison. So there is this strong relation. So those adults, they try to play the role of older sisters or mothers, and they still call them. Now in our forum, we have some of those girls who were in prison with the older generation. They call them mom, or they call them auntie, or they will never say their name like this, because they have this relationship. They try to take the responsibility to help them how to act in front of the guards, how to interact with the prison administration. And after their release, this is the thing, they start to live the contradiction. They were children when they were arrested for their family. So when they are released, if they spend shorter period, for example, they can be released when they are 17 or 18 even. So they have to go back to themselves as children. So for their family, they have to be protected by their family. So it's kind of contradicted how they have to perform their political development, and at the same time, how they have to act as children for this family. And of course, families, in many cases, they overprotect them. They don't allow them to talk about their prison experience in many aspects. And they try to guide them and to be guards for them all the time, because they don't want to lose them in some points. So it's kind of this experience holding many layers with it, of being a child, then an adult, then a child and adult again. You have to perform in a specific way in front of the community. You have to perform in a specific way in front of your family. And the interesting thing, because I look into their journals, and their they have this magazine they used to do inside prison. And if you look at it, it is very kind of like things, puzzles, jokes, drawings, and this kind of things people do when they are 12 or 14. So it's kind of, they are trying to live their childhood inside prison, expressing this through these activities, but at the same time, they have to act independent. They have to be adults in many perspectives. So I think it's something that needs to be looked at. And I think these girls, when they are released, they really need a psychological support in many perspectives for the trauma they lived. Especially they talked, like when I hear them talking about the arrest night, or when they were arrested, it's very painful. Like I couldn't say anything to them, because they still have this pain. They still cannot sleep at night easily, imagining how they were arrested, how they faced torture, for example, when they were 14 or 13. So this is the one side. For the other side, for the Israeli academics, I find it hard for me to read their work. So sometimes I try to ignore it as a way, because it's kind of, I feel upset, and then I start to be, try to be not, I don't want to be kind of responding to them. I just need to respond to them. I like to go to these women's stories and show how they are acting and how they live their life, not through the Israeli academics in some perspectives. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. We have a question from Yasser. Yasser, would you like to ask a question?
Thank you, Gwen, and thanks to Samah and Victoria. I want just to respond to the question that was raised by Aisha about the available services when it comes to mental health services. And I think in West Bank, there are two well-equipped centers that can provide help to ex-prisoners, women ex-prisoners, which is the Palestine Counseling Center and the the Torture Rehabilitation Center in Ramallah. In Gaza Strip, we have the Gaza Community Mental Health Program, of course, with the 3 community centers that we have. Another point in that is that sometimes it's very difficult for women themselves to try to reach out to services because they are put in a scene of heroism, you know, and sometimes it's very difficult to attempt to leave the scenario of being a hero, just an ex-prisoner, and just to show that things were not that good. So they need a lot of courage in order to be able to reach those services. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Yasser. And I think we're probably now coming to the end of our Cafe Palestine. The cafe will close in 4 to 5 minutes. So I would like first of all to, and we have a little treat in store, which I will introduce in a moment. I'd just like to thank Samah and Victoria from the bottom of my heart for those really powerful and moving, emotional testimonies, and to Victoria for presenting May's work so beautifully, and to May for being here in person. And it's been a huge privilege to have your presence as well, May. So thank you for those contributions, which have been so rich. So it's now my great pleasure to ask Heba to introduce our final piece of music. Thank you, Heba.
Thank you, Gwen. I agree with you, Victoria, when you say that music plays an important role in May Masri's film 3000 Nights, somehow bringing soul to the intensity of the body of images. Equally, I found the finale song, the last song in the film, very, very beautiful and healing, and brought really dignity and meaning to the suffering of those Palestinian women imprisoned. So I wanted to share it with you. And the song is called Ya Dhalam al-Sijni, Prison's Darkness. This is a poem written in 1922 by a Syrian journalist and poet, Najib al-Rayis, while he was imprisoned on the island of Al-Wad on the Syrian coast near Tartus. And he was imprisoned by the French authorities for defying French colonialism in Syria and Lebanon. The Jordanian singer Makadi has dedicated the song to all Palestinian prisoners, more specifically those in Gaza and throughout Palestine, to address the excessive number of Palestinian political prisoners and to soothe the suffering endured from psychological and physical torture. The music is composed by Mohammed Fleifel, renowned with his brother for their activism through music against the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the ensuing colonization of Palestine by the British and Syria and Lebanon by the French. I've translated the lyrics as best I can this morning, so you'd have it on the chat box. And here it is.
يا ظلام الخيم نحن لا نخشى الظلام نحن لا نخشى الظلام ليس بعد الليل إلا فجر مجد يتسامى ليس بعد الليل إلا فجر مجد يتسامى يا رنين القيد زدني نغمة تشجي فؤادي يا رنين القيد زدني نغمة تشجي فؤادي إن في صوتك معنى للأسى والاضطهاد إن في صوتك معنى للأسى والاضطهاد يا ظلام السجن خيم نحن لا نخشى الظلام يا ظلام السجن خيم نحن لا نخشى الظلام ليس بعد الليل إلا فجر مجد يتسامى ليس بعد الليل إلا فجر مجد يتسامى لم أكن يوما أثيما لم أخن يوما نداما لم أكن يوما أثيما لم أخن يوما نظاما إنما حب بلادي في فؤادي قد أقام إنما حب بلادي في فؤادي قد أقام وتعاهدنا جميعا يوم أقسمنا اليمين وتعاهدنا جميعا يوم أقسمنا اليمين لن نخون الأرض يوما واتخذنا الحب دينا لن نخون الأرض يوما واتخذنا الحب دينا